There are pains that exams don't capture, anguish that no medicine can calm, and nights when the body lies down, but the soul remains at war. Have you ever felt this? As if something inside you was screaming for relief while the world sleeps in silence? What if I told you that there is an ancient, living, and effective forgotten key capable of opening doors of healing while you rest? We are not talking about empty words, but about a real power that spans the centuries, the Psalms, declarations born of pain but anointed by faith. They reveal that it is not sleep that brings rest, but God who sustains until dawn. If you feel like you need something that goes beyond science, beyond what the eyes see, stay with this video, because today, as you listen and surrender, God Himself can begin to heal where no one else can touch. There is a prayer that has crossed the centuries like a whisper of the human soul in search of rest. It arises at the most vulnerable moment of the day, when the body lies down and the mind tries to rest amid pain, thoughts, and uncertainties. It is when the soul cries out in silence for something that science cannot reach, that medicine cannot touch, that sleep cannot solve. A prayer that does not need many words, but carries the power to touch heaven. Psalm 3 verse 5 records a declaration of trust that remains alive to this day. I lie down and sleep in peace, and I awake again, for the Lord sustains me. These words were written at one of the most agonizing moments in King David's life, not during his ascension to the throne, nor during a military victory, but while he was fleeing from his own son, Absalom. A time when the throne was threatened, allies were divided, and family pain bled deeper than any sword. David felt surrounded, betrayed, and weakened. Yet he lay down and slept. Not because he was afraid, but because he was faithful. He did not give in to despair. He surrendered himself to God. This detail changes everything, because it shows that it is not the absence of problems that allows rest. It is the presence of God. There is something profoundly healing in this verse. While the city sleeps, the heart of the afflicted remains awake. But when he decides to rest in God's promises, the body finds relief and the soul begins to be restored. It is not about closing our eyes as a mechanical act, but about closing our anxieties, our anguish, our memories, and our guilt. It is about trusting that God remains on guard when sleep takes over our body, that He acts while our eyes close. The healing that comes from prayer is not just in what is asked for, but in the simple act of trusting. There is power in surrendering, even when there is no strength left to pray. There are nights when words do not come, only tears. There are nights when silence is the only possible language. And even so, God listens, God acts, God sustains. Because prayer does not need to be eloquent, it needs to be sincere. And the sincerity of a broken heart is worth more than 1,000 memorized words. When David wrote this psalm, he was not in a temple or a sacred environment. He was in the desert, on the run. The external environment was hostile, but the internal environment was surrendered to the sovereignty of God. This reveals that the environment around us does not limit the divine movement. The bed where someone suffers can become an altar. The room where someone cries can become a sanctuary. The sleepless night can be the time when heaven bends down to hear the most honest cry. Therefore, there is healing happening even in the silence, even in the dark, even during sleep. This healing may not be immediate or visible. Sometimes it is not a physical healing, but a release from anxiety, anguish, and fear. Sometimes the body remains weak, but the spirit rises. There are illnesses that do not show up in tests, but they erode hope, extinguish faith, and silence the soul. And it is in this invisible place that the Word of God acts. The psalm does not say that David was healed. It says that he slept, woke up, and was sustained. This means that even without complete resolution, he experienced enough relief to continue. This is the essence of nighttime prayer based on the Psalms. It is not a magic formula, but a spiritual disposition. It is saying to the Lord, I no longer have control, so I place everything in your hands. It is resting knowing that the true watchman of the night is not light sleep nor medicine, but God's faithfulness. Those who pray with this understanding are saying, even if I do not see healing now, I know that I am being sustained. And this is already the beginning of restoration. Psalm 3 has a structure that reveals the cycle of the soul in suffering. It begins with a cry, moves on to confidence, and ends with a declaration of victory. It is a progression that repeats itself in the lives of many who face illness. The cry comes first, because suffering does not wait for the right moment to appear. But when the heart turns to the Creator, even if in pieces, a type of trust is born that is independent of circumstances. And this trust is not passive. She transforms, it relieves, she sustains. There is something profoundly therapeutic about repeating the words of Scripture before bed, because by repeating them, the mind is reprogrammed and the spirit is reminded of where its strength comes from. When I say, I lay down and sleep and wake again, for the Lord sustains me, the body not only hears, it responds. The heart slows, tension lessens, faith rises, and even if pain remains, it no longer dictates the rhythm of the soul. The word takes its place. And that is where prayer begins to heal. Because healing is not just the absence of pain, but the return of peace. It is not just the disappearance of the illness, but the restoration of the soul. There are people who wake up physically healed but remain sick inside. And there are others who remain physically frail but shine inside as if they were already experiencing heaven. This is the silent miracle that happens when prayer becomes a habit and not a last resort. The prayer of the Psalms is not just any prayer. It is a spiritual legacy left by men who lived through real anguish and faced persecution, illness, and loss. And yet, they trusted. When we recite these words today, we are connecting with centuries of unshakable faith. We are saying to the same God who heard David, "Hear my cry too. Sustain my night too. Heal what no one sees." This type of prayer does not depend on environment, condition, or emotional strength. It is born in fatigue, blossoms in vulnerability, and bears fruit in hope. That is why, even when there are no more words, the Psalms pray for us. They express what the soul feels but cannot name. And in doing so, they make room for the Spirit of God to work in the depths of our being, even while we sleep. When the human heart finds space to rest in the midst of chaos, something extraordinary happens. It is not the absence of problems that defines true rest, but the presence of trust. This trust is shaped, strengthened, and sustained by a certainty that depends not on vision, but on faith. And it is precisely in this scenario that Psalm 3 becomes a map for those who walk through dark nights. Verse 5 stands out as a point of light, but it is not isolated. The entire composition of the psalm carries the tension of a heart surrounded by enemies and sustained by a conviction that cannot be shaken. Early on, David recognizes the multiplication of adversaries, not only external, but also internal. Many say, "There is no salvation for him in God." This phrase is not just someone else's comment. It is an attempt to undermine faith at the moment when it most needs to remain firm. How many times, when faced with illness, does a silent voice try to convince us that there is no hope, that there is no answer, that all is lost? But it is precisely at this time that the soul needs to remember who its shield is, where its glory comes from, and who lifts its head. It is not the diagnosis, it is not the opinion of others, it is God. There is a difference between praying and praying with trust. The former may be born of desperation, but the latter is born of the certainty that, even without seeing, God is listening. And this is what David does when he says, "I cried out to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain." What seems like a detail is actually a foundation. The God who listens is not distant, is not indifferent, and is not asleep. He answers. And this answer does not need to come in the form of audible words or immediate changes. Sometimes the answer is the peace that invades the chest, even when everything remains the same on the outside. This peace is the basis of inner healing. The human soul becomes ill when it loses its ability to trust, when fear sets in, when anguish paralyzes, when despair takes over the space of hope. And that is why praying with the Psalms is not only a spiritual practice, but also a tool for restoration, because it rebuilds the inner space, removing the emotional debris that accumulates over time. David did not wait for everything to be resolved to rest. He rested because he knew in whom he trusted, and this trust was not built in a moment. It was cultivated in many deserts, many falls, and many tears. Parallel to Psalm 3, Psalm 4 expands on this scenario. Also attributed to David, it presents a phrase that echoes the same spirit. "In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety." This repetition of ideas between the two psalms is no coincidence. It is confirmation that inner security does not depend on circumstances. While the battles continue outside, the soul finds shelter in God. This truth may seem simple, but it becomes revolutionary when applied to real life. It is possible to rest even when you do not have all the answers. It is possible to find healing even without an immediate miracle. Faith does not deny reality, but rather transforms the way we face it. The body may be weak, and the diagnosis may be discouraging, but there is an invisible force supporting those who decide to trust. And this force does not come from within, but from above. It is not produced by the mind, but planted by the Spirit. Nighttime prayer based on the Psalms is like a seed sown in the dark soil of the heart. It does not germinate in the eyes, but works silently until it bursts into life. While the body rests, the Word activates healing processes that go beyond what reason can understand. There are people who spend sleepless nights trying to find relief in what is temporary: repetitive thoughts, growing anxiety, frantic searches for control. But when the soul is trained to trust, it learns to let go. And it is in this letting go that healing begins. Prayer then becomes more than words, it becomes surrender. And in this surrender, something shifts in the invisible. The heart, previously agitated, finds a firm surface to rest on. The mind, previously in turmoil, becomes still before the presence of God. This is the effect that the psalm has. It does not change the scenario immediately, but it changes the posture of those who are within it. In the midst of pain, what is most tiring is not the illness itself, but the weight of not knowing what will come. The future seems uncertain, tomorrow is frightening, and today becomes unbearable. But by repeating, even in a low voice, the words of the Psalms, the soul finds its way back. Because each verse is like a step back home, a reminder that God is still in control, even when everything seems to be falling apart. David knew this. Even when he was running away, even when he was in tears, he raised his head. And this was not a symbolic gesture, it was a spiritual attitude, because whoever raises their eyes to God finds the ground where they can stand firmly. This type of faith is not emotional, it is not the result of euphoria, it is deep, silent, and resistant. It's the kind of faith that sustains you when pain persists, that persists when resources run out, who insists on trusting when everything says otherwise. And it is this kind of faith that is formed when the Psalms become nightly prayers, not as rituals, but as heartfelt conversations. When the Psalm becomes a cry of the soul. When the Bible stops being a separate book and becomes a bridge between the heart of man and the heart of God. Prayer before bed should not be a last-ditch gesture. It should be the first step toward true rest. And this rest is not just physical, it is spiritual, it is emotional. It is a return to the original state of trust, a return to the bosom of the one who sustains all things. David did not sleep because he was tired. He slept because he knew he could trust, and he woke up because he was sustained. This simple cycle is, in fact, a profound revelation. Each night of rest in God is a healing in progress. Each surrender made in prayer is a battle won in the unseen. And each morning that arrives with life is a silent testimony that God still sustains, still answers, still heals. The soul that learns to rest in God carries within itself a strength that is independent of external circumstances. Even in the face of pain, she does not give in to despair. Even in the midst of uncertainty, she doesn't lose her bearings. This force is invisible, but it transforms everything it touches. It does not come from encouraging words or catchphrases, but from the solid truth that sustains those who decide to trust the Lord above their own emotions. Prayer based on Psalms activates this force because it reconnects us to the source. And when you are connected to the source, even the wounded branches come back to life. This is why there are people who, even when going through severe illnesses, radiate peace. They do not deny reality, they do not ignore suffering, but they do not surrender to it either. This peace is born from communion with the Word, not as a repeated mantra, but as an internalized truth. The psalm becomes a voice when it is read with faith, and this voice echoes within, reaching forgotten areas of the heart. Fear recedes, anxiety is silenced, and the soul finds shelter. This healing process that happens through prayer is not always perceived immediately. It often acts as the formation of roots underground. You can't see it, but it's happening. You can't hear it, but it's growing. And when the fruits appear, they are undeniable. Patience grows stronger, trust matures, faith ceases to be unstable, and the body, although limited, begins to experience the reflections of a renewed spirit. Because the healed interior influences the exterior. A healthy heart transmits life to the body. If this message is already speaking to you in some way, write Amen here in the comments. This helps the video reach more people and strengthens this chain of faith and healing. The book of Proverbs confirms this when it says that a cheerful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. This is not superficial optimism, but a joy that is born of the certainty that God still cares, still restores, still answers. When prayer becomes constant, the spirit is strengthened. And a strengthened spirit resists the pressure of illness with a different attitude, not of denial, but of firmness, not of escape, but of trust. This does not mean that the pain disappears, but that it no longer dominates. Among the many expressions of faith found in the Psalms, there is one that reveals the process of inner transformation that occurs when one prays sincerely. In Psalm 30, David declares, "Lord my God, I cried out to you for help, and you healed me." This cure is not detailed. We don't know if it was physical, emotional, spiritual, or all at the same time. But we know there was a response, there was restoration, there has been a change, and that's enough. Because the deepest healing is not always the one that happens in the body, but the one that reorganizes the soul, the one that restores balance, the one that restores the spirit, the one that lights up hope. The prayer of the Psalms is honest. She doesn't hide the pain. She doesn't pretend strength. David screams, cries, questions, and begs. And this is an invitation to sincerity before God, because it is in this truth that healing happens. When prayer ceases to be a formal act and becomes an outpouring of the Spirit, heaven opens. God never rejects a broken heart, never ignore a cry that arises from pain, and even if the answer takes time, it has already begun the moment the soul opened. While many people look for quick solutions, the Psalm teaches the path of depth. It is in the faithful repetition of trust that the miracle happens. Not as magic, but as a process. Not as a spectacle, but as a silent testimony of those who persevere. And this perseverance is, in itself, a miracle. In a fast-paced, superficial and immediate world, trusting patiently is an inner revolution. It is proof that the Spirit of God is at work. There are times when all one can do is repeat the words of the psalm as if holding on to a rope in the dark. Even without seeing a way out, prayer sustains. Even without feeling it, faith anchors. There is something profound in remaining faithful even in God's silence, because this silence is not absence, it is care, it is invisible work, it is preparation. David himself faced long periods of divine silence, but he did not give up. He kept praying, he kept hoping, he kept trusting, and this persistence kept him alive. Nowadays, it is common to seek healing in places that offer instant comfort, but true healing rarely comes through easy paths. It requires surrender, it requires permanence, it requires continuous faith. And this is what the prayer of the Psalms promotes. A faith that is not fed by results, but by presence. A faith that does not demand proof, but remains steadfast. When the heart is molded to the Word, it learns to breathe in God's rhythm. It learns to wait in God's time. It learns to rest even without answers. This rest is not a passive state, it is an active state of trust, It is the result of nights given, of words repeated with faith, of tears not wasted. Every prayer said before going to sleep is a brick in the construction of an inner refuge. Each verse spoken with sincerity is a step toward the invisible healing that paves the way for the visible. And even though the body continues to struggle, the soul finds peace. Because the real miracle is waking up feeling supported. It's getting through another day knowing you're not alone. The Psalms were not written in times of stability. They were the fruit of wars, escapes, losses, and betrayals. And that is what makes them so real. They do not speak of an idealized faith, but of a faith lived to the limit. A faith that bleeds but does not die. A faith that stumbles but gets up. And it is this faith that heals, because it recognizes the pain but does not give in to it. It recognizes the weariness but continues to pray. It recognizes the weakness but continues to believe. And in this continuation, restoration happens. There is a healing that comes with time, and there is another that comes with truth. The prayer of the Psalms unites the two, because it respects God's time and is anchored in the truth of the Word. And that is enough. It is not necessary to understand everything. It is not necessary to control everything. It is necessary to trust, to repeat with faith, even without feeling, to pray, even without strength, and to rest, knowing that the God who sustained David in the middle of the desert continues to sustain all who lie down in peace, trusting in his care. When we understand that prayer does not need to be perfect to be powerful, our hearts approach God more freely. It is not eloquence that attracts the divine gaze, but sincerity. The Psalms show us that the language of heaven is closer to true groaning than to rehearsed rhetoric. There are prayers that are born on our knees, but there are also those that arise in the silence of a pillow wet with tears. Both are heard, both have value, both have an effect. Among so many psalms of supplication and trust, there is one that reveals the intimate process of those who pray and hope for healing, even when their bodies are in ruins. Psalm 6 records the cry of someone who can no longer bear the weight of pain. "Have mercy on me, O Lord, for I am weak. Heal me, for my bones are shaken." It is a direct, unfiltered confession. The bones, which support the body, symbolize here what is most deeply being affected. The internal structure, physical and emotional, is compromised, and yet prayer persists. Even in weakness, there is a search for God. This psalm is a mirror for many who, in the dead of night, pray without knowing if they are being heard, who feel their bodies failing, their minds wavering, and their spirits wavering. But even so, they continue to speak to God. And this perseverance, even if unnoticed, is one of the greatest expressions of faith. There is no greater effort than to continue trusting when everything around us says otherwise. When the mirror shows fatigue, when the tests confirm bad news, when the pain does not cease. Prayer, at this point, is no longer a formality. It is a thread of life. And it is precisely at this time that prayer becomes healing. Not because it instantly changes the scenario, but because it prevents despair from setting in. Despair is the absence of meaning, the lack of ground, and the feeling of abandonment. And it is against this that the psalm rises up. With each phrase, there is a reaffirmation that, even in anguish, there is a direction. Even in pain, there is a place of refuge. Even in tears, there is someone who listens. Healing, then, begins in the memory that God is close to those who have a broken heart, and this closeness changes everything. Psalm 41 also provides a powerful image of divine care in the context of illness. It states that the Lord sustains him on his bed of pain and transforms the bed of affliction into a place of restoration. This statement is more than poetic. It is a promise. The bed, which could be a symbol of weakness, becomes a symbol of divine intervention. The place of pain becomes a place of miracles. There is no environment in which God cannot act. The silent room, the cold hospital, the bed of someone who no longer has the strength to get up. All of these places can become altars. Because where there is prayer, there is room for the supernatural. Even if no one else sees it, even if there are no human witnesses, God sees, God acts, God transforms. That is why prayer before going to sleep has such profound value. It does not just end the day. It delivers the day into the right hands. It does not just precede sleep. It prepares the heart to be treated while the body rests, and this treatment is done with the precision of someone who knows every area of the soul, every unspoken wound, every hidden fear, every repressed desire. The prayer of the Psalms teaches us to name our pain, to bring to light what our hearts try to hide, and in doing so, it brings healing, because what is revealed before God can be restored. What is exposed in prayer is enveloped by mercy. The Psalms do not deny suffering. They name it, they face it, they surrender it, and because of this, they become a source of life. There is something sacred in repeating words written by someone who also suffered, who also had dark nights, who also did not understand God's ways, but who, even so, continued to speak to him. It is in this continuity that the secret lies. Praying one day is easy. Praying every night, even without seeing any change, requires dedication. It requires sustained faith. And this faith is built on promises, not feelings. Feelings fluctuate, promises remain. And among them is the certainty that the Lord is the one who heals. He heals the body when it is His will. He heals the soul when it is wounded. He heals thoughts when they are filled with anxiety. He heals the spirit when it is downcast. And often, this healing begins with a simple phrase said with faith before going to sleep. There is no routine that cannot become sacred when it is filled with the presence of God. The act of lying down may be a common gesture, but when it is done in trust, it becomes an act of worship. It is like saying, "I can do nothing more, so I leave everything in your hands," and in doing so, the soul rests, the body relaxes, the mind slows down, because the spirit recognizes that it is no longer in control. And in this recognition, it finds freedom. The freedom of not carrying everything alone, the freedom of being cared for by a father who watches over the sleep of his children. This awareness transforms the way we view the night. It stops being a space of fear and becomes a territory of surrender. Even if the body is tired, even if the soul is wounded, even if the thoughts are confused, all of this can be taken to God. And He does not reject, He welcomes, He listens, He responds, even if in silence, even if invisible, He is present, and that is enough. There are nights when all one can do is repeat the same verses, but this repetition, done with faith, is a declaration of resistance. It is the soul saying, "I still believe, I still hope, I still trust." And this silent insistence has power because it reveals a heart that has not given up, that has chosen to continue, that has decided to lie down and rest, even when rest seems impossible. And in this gesture, God begins to act. The healing that God works during the night does not follow human parameters. It does not need to be announced with visible signs or happen in a spectacular way. Sometimes it manifests itself in such a subtle way that it is only noticed as the days go by. Anxiety that no longer dominates as before, thoughts that no longer revolve around pain, a lightness that sets in for no apparent reason. All of these are signs that God is acting, that, while the body slept, the spirit was working in silence. There is a particular beauty in the way the Psalms reveal this dynamic. The 107th Psalm, for example, describes times when the people cried out in their distress, and God heard them. One of the verses says that He sent His word and healed them and delivered them from death. This healing did not come from a physical touch, but from a word. And this shows that divine healing is often a matter of alignment between the soul and the truth. When the word is heard and received in faith, the whole body responds. For the word is not just sound, it is alive. It penetrates what is hidden. It rearranges what is disordered. And when this word is received before sleep, it acts even while the conscience is at rest. Many illnesses find fertile ground in the weariness of the soul, the mind that does not rest, the heart that does not calm down, the guilt that is not treated, the sadness that accumulates. The body then begins to reflect this invisible weight, pain that has no explanation, symptoms that have no physical cause, and exhaustion for no apparent reason. Medicine recognizes the connection between the emotional and the physical, but the Bible already indicated this link long ago. And that is why the prayer of the Psalms has so much power. It treats the origin of the pain. It reaches the point where medicine cannot reach. It works in the invisible. Psalm 38 expresses this reality profoundly. David speaks of foul-smelling and festering wounds because of his foolishness. He speaks of a bent and very dejected body, of incessant groans. It is a portrait of a man consumed inside, but it is also the portrait of someone who, even in this state, continues to speak to God. He continues to hope for help. He continues to believe that the divine hand can still reach the deepest depths. And this type of prayer is what transforms pain into a place of encounter. When prayer becomes a safe space for honest outbursts, the soul begins to rebuild itself. There is no need to hide weakness. The Psalms are proof of this. They do not avoid suffering, but face it with faith. They do not feign strength, but reveal dependence. And this dependence, paradoxically, is what strengthens. When the heart surrenders itself completely, even when broken, it becomes a fertile field for miracles. And this miracle can begin with a simple sigh in the early morning. It is not a matter of reciting the Psalms as an amulet, but of praying with the awareness that each word is a bridge between the wounded spirit and the God who heals. It is recognizing that, by declaring that the Lord sustains us while we sleep, we are affirming a truth more powerful than any diagnosis. It is a gesture of surrender that confounds logic but pleases the heart of God. Because faith is not always a cry of victory. It's often a tired whisper that says, "I'm still here." Psalm 62 reinforces this place of silent trust. It says that only in God does the soul rest, and from Him comes salvation. This statement carries an invitation to wait quietly, to trust that does not require haste. In a time when everything seems urgent, learning to wait in silence before God is an act of spiritual resistance. It is telling the inner world that there is a greater rhythm, that there is a divine time, and that one can trust in that time. And while one waits, prayer continues to be the thread that keeps the soul connected. Healing will not always come as expected, but that does not diminish God's action. There are illnesses that He chooses not to remove, but He always sustains those who go through them. He always strengthens those who trust in Him. He always brings peace to those who surrender. This type of healing is deeper. It reconfigures the way we look at things. It makes suffering stop being the center of our lives and become part of the path. A path where God still guides, still speaks, still manifests Himself. Many people find it difficult to pray at night because silence amplifies their thoughts. Their pain becomes more evident, their loneliness weighs more heavily. But that is precisely why this is such a good time for prayer. Because it is there, without distractions, that the truth of the heart emerges. And when this truth is brought before God with sincerity, it finds acceptance. Even if there are no immediate answers, there is comfort. Even if there is no instant healing, there is presence. And this presence is what sustains us. Psalm 55 presents the lament of someone who no longer finds peace. The psalmist speaks of restlessness, of trembling, of anguish in his chest. But in the midst of this inner chaos, he says, "Evening, morning, and at noon, I will complain and groan, and He will hear my voice." This shows that prayer is constant. It does not depend on emotional disposition. It is a decision. And this decision, made every night, builds a spiritual fortress. Even when the soul is fragile, the choice to pray establishes roots of faith that withstand the storms. There is a cycle of restoration that is formed when the night is transformed into a time of prayer. The day, marked by tiredness and struggles, does not end in chaos. It ends in surrender. And this surrender changes the beginning of the next day. When one wakes up after a sincere prayer, even if the problems remain, the heart is lighter, the mind is clearer, the disposition returns because the soul has been cared for. And this care turns into resistance, into renewed faith, into hope that refuses to die. Praying the Psalms creates this environment, a space where one can be weak without being rejected, where one can be true without being punished, where one can cry without being silenced. And by finding this safe place every night, the heart learns that it is not alone. It learns that God is listening, that even when everything seems to stand still, He continues to work. Even when silence prevails, He continues to listen. And as the soul rests in this understanding, healing takes place. There is a type of healing that happens without fanfare. It does not announce itself with visible signs, nor does it depend on the absence of symptoms. It takes hold slowly, like the light that overcomes the dawn. It is the healing that God performs in secret, the healing that manifests itself when the soul, little by little, relearns to breathe, when the heart, even though wounded, starts beating with hope again. This process is silent but powerful. It does not need to be understood to be real. It only needs to be accepted. Nights of prayer, fueled by the sincerity of the Psalms, create space for this kind of miracle. With each new day that begins after true surrender, there is a new measure of strength available. Trust grows like a seed watered in the dark. Even when the eyes do not yet see transformation, the interior is already being shaped. God's faithfulness does not depend on human perception. It manifests itself because He is, because He promised to be present in all seasons of life, even the most difficult ones. Psalm 91 brings an image that connects deeply with this certainty. He speaks of Him who dwells in the secret place of the Most High and abides under the shadow of the Almighty. This is not just a poetic figure, it is a spiritual reality. The hiding place of the Most High is not a physical place, but a state of surrender. It is the place where the soul finds shelter, where the presence of God surrounds, protects, and sustains. And it is in this place that healing becomes inevitable, because fear has no place there, the anguish loses strength, faith is strengthened. Even in the face of the most intense pain, those who rest in the Lord learn to differentiate suffering from despair. Suffering may continue, but it no longer dominates. Despair melts away in the presence of a God who sustains. The psalm states that He will command His angels to guard you in all your ways. And this promise extends to each person who places themselves before Him with sincerity. There is no prayer unheeded. There is no night wasted when you choose to trust. Trust is built with daily choices, choosing to recite the Psalms before bed, even when the pain is still there. Choosing to say that God is your refuge, even when the world seems to be falling apart. Choosing to surrender your fears instead of feeding them. And these choices, repeated night after night, transform your inner structure. They create a firmer soul, a lighter heart, a clearer mind. Even if everything on the outside remains the same, on the inside, everything begins to reorganize. Psalm 119, the longest of all, reveals this dynamic in detail. It speaks of the power of God's word in the midst of affliction. It declares that it was in suffering that the psalmist learned the statutes of the Lord. It shows that there is wisdom in the midst of pain, and this wisdom does not come from theory, but from experience. When someone prays the Psalms honestly, they are making room for the pain not to be in vain, for it to teach, for it to deepen, for it to purify. Prayer does not automatically remove difficulties, but it transforms the person praying. Psalm 57, written by David while hiding in a cave, reveals this transformation. Even surrounded by threats, he declares that his heart is steadfast, not because circumstances have changed, but because he has chosen to trust. This steadfastness is the result of previous nights of surrender, of early mornings when, even though he was afraid, he chose to lie down and rest. And this rest became a shield. This choice became healing. At the end of so many prayers, perhaps the pain is still there, perhaps the body is still fragile, but something is different. The soul is no longer so afflicted, the spirit is no longer in pieces, the mind is no longer so confused, and this silent progress is a miracle that happens from the inside out. It begins with the repetition of an ancient truth. I lie down and sleep, and I wake up again, because the Lord sustains me. This seemingly simple phrase carries a depth that only those who have experienced dark nights can understand. Because it does not just speak of sleep, it speaks of faith. It does not just deal with the act of waking up, but with the fact of being sustained. Sustained when there was no more strength. Sustained when everything seemed to be falling apart. Sustained when the days were long and the nights even longer. This support is the mark of divine care. It does not depend on the strength of the person praying, but on the faithfulness of the person listening. Every night a sincere prayer is said, something happens. Even if you don't notice it right away, the spiritual atmosphere changes. The soul is washed, the mind is relieved, the heart is touched. And this constancy creates a path, a silent but steady path towards healing that is not rushed but deepens. Psalm-based prayer is that way, a road where you walk with confidence, even without understanding everything, where you can rest, even without seeing everything resolved. Because in the end, the greatest cure is this, knowing that one is not alone, that there is a God who watches over one's sleep, who receives each prayer with attention, who transforms the outburst into an answer, who collects each tear and waters the seeds of faith with it. And this faith, even if small, even if tired, is what sustains. It is what strengthens. It is what heals. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so that we can continue to bring you more in-depth research and analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps in the growth of the channel and in the production of even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.